Welcome back. Now, a leading University of Cape Town pulmonologist is calling on the government to accelerate the passing of a new law to regulate vaping. Professor Richard van Zyl-Smit conducted a study looking at vaping trends among matric pupils, and the results were alarming. The study revealed that more than 1 in 4 matric pupils were vaping. Now let's unpack this with Professor Richard van Zyl-Smit, a researcher at the University of Cape Town's Lung Institute. Professor, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, your study revealed that more than 25% of matrics, especially those in affluent areas, are vaping. What amount of pressure are these young people experiencing that leads them to look for such a dopamine release to help them cope?
Yeah, Katlego, the numbers are startling. We only looked at high-income schools. We haven't looked at lower-income schools at this point. So we only have data from these wealthier schools per se. But yeah, I mean, I think the pressures that our young school learners are under are huge, not only at school, but I think around life, future, finances, all of that. And we're seeing vaping as something that many of them appear to be turning to try and cope with the stresses that they're feeling.
So from your research, how young are they when they start? And is there a prevalence to nicotine addiction in the future once they do start with vaping from a very young age?
So we're looking at high school students, so anything from grade 8 to grade 12. We have a much lower percentage, but I mean, they're still present in grade 8. So I mean, that's your 13-year-olds, 12, 13-year-olds already starting to vape. It picks up quite dramatically in the sort of 11, 12 grades, but we're seeing grade 8s that are vaping. And yeah, we ask some questions. We can't obviously determine true nicotine addiction via a survey, but we ask questions such as, can you get through the school day without vaping? How soon do you vape after you wake up? Do you start feeling angry or anxious if you can't get to your vaping? And we're seeing anywhere between 25-30% of these learners who are clearly exhibiting signs that we would attribute to nicotine addiction.
So, Prof, when a young person then is exposed to nicotine, it makes it difficult for them to quit, first of all, but it also affects the development of that child's brain. What other physical or developmental defects could occur to a young body when exposed so early?
So the major challenges with nicotine we see obviously is the addiction, and you mentioned dopamine earlier on. That reward cycle gets very well entrenched, and so the risk then of these young school learners getting that reward dopamine type of cycle in their brain potentially leads to further addiction and other issues with other drugs later on, which is of concern. But nicotine, in its interaction with the brain, can impact on their schoolwork, can impact on their sports performance. And so that's really some of the major concerns. And then amongst the other chemicals in these vaping devices, they are not harmless in and of themselves. These high school students also have developing lungs, and exposing those lungs to any chemicals other than fresh air also potentially has impact on the growth and development of their lungs. And some of these chemicals can also impact on blood vessels, so we're worried about their heart potentially as well going forwards.
That's quite alarming, Prof, but surely those decorated flavors such as apple and cinnamon and vanilla couldn't possibly be that harmful.
So they're not harmful if you eat them, and that's where the problem lies. There are many studies looking at the various chemicals, so things like cherry, vanilla, even cinnamon can impact on what's called the endothelium, that's the lining of blood vessels. Cinnamon particularly affects the cilia, the little hairs in your lungs that help you clear out mucus. And so each of these chemicals or flavorants are fine if you eat them, but if you heat them to several hundred degrees and breathe them in, it's a completely different ballgame. And that's really where those of us in the lung space start having issues with the claims that these vaping devices are completely harmless.
Sure, that's quite scary, Prof. I mean, maybe if we can just get into the laws around this, because 30 countries across the globe have banned e-cigarettes. However, South Africa's laws, on the other hand, currently don't make provisions for the sale of vapes, especially to people under the age of 18. Now, regulations proposed in the new tobacco control bill will change the way that e-cigarettes and those products are marketed and sold. But will this give us any kind of headway in moving young people away from such products?
So if we look at the control of substances and products, anything from alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, there's the marketing element, so what you are exposed to. We all know the more you see an advert, the more likely you are to try it. So certainly banning of the advertising, particularly advertising that targets young people, and much of the advertising is with young, attractive models, not old, wrinkly people trying to give up smoking. So that's the one element. And then the sale of tobacco is banned under the age of 18, which makes it more difficult. You can still buy cigarettes, and many of these high school students are buying cigarettes illegally. But at the moment, you can walk into any shopping mall, go onto any online retailer and just purchase them directly. So we do need legislation that controls the sale, the marketing, the branding towards young people, which is a starting point. It's not going to solve everything, but it's a critical starting point to have that in whilst we then educate. And many of the high school learners that I've spoken to are not aware of half of the different chemicals in vaping devices, half of the potential problems, because the marketing just says this is hip and trendy, it's fashionable, you can do fantastic tricks, and so this is what you guys should be doing.
And if that's the way they're putting it out, Prof, what then do you say to those e-cigarette manufacturers who say that you can't regulate e-cigarettes and normal cigarettes in the same way?
So the problem with vaping products is that they don't fit into any legislation. And the vaping industry itself tries to find a gap in the market. So they're not a food substance, they're not a health product, they're not a medication, they're not technically a tobacco product. So they have to be regulated in a manner. And laws are difficult, and laws can be quite clumsy. So in the US, for example, they've deemed nicotine to be regulatable by the FDA, and so it's part of their regulation. In South Africa, the easiest way to create legislation is to bring it into the tobacco control policies and regulations. And there's no reason why vaping products should be in any way different from tobacco. Yes, they are different, but they have the same risks, different risks, and additional risks to adolescents. And so they have to be regulated in some format. Government has decided that this is the best way to do it. And I don't think if the vaping industry is true to themselves and saying that this is a product to help smokers quit, then there's no problem with the current legislation. If the vaping industry wants their products to be freely available to everyone, including minors, well, then they are going to have a problem with the proposed legislation.
Sure. So in the interim, Prof, you touched on education, and while we're waiting for the bill to be passed into law, what advice would you then have for young people and for their guardians and any other person who relies on these vaping products? What advice would you have for them?
So I've lectured at several high schools around the country on this topic, and it's difficult to tell adolescents you may not. And so the approach that many of us have taken is to say, look, there's lots of marketing. There are people that are lying to you around these products. These are the facts, and you need to make an informed decision. High school students, adolescents, university students will do whatever they want to do, but they need to be informed. And at the moment, there's no counterbalance to the marketing, the TikTok adverts, the online stuff. So we need to provide that counterbalance. That's not a pejorative, dictatorial approach, but just to say, actually, these products, although they may be safer than a product that kills half the people that use them, that's the wrong yardstick. And so I always argue that the true test of vaping safety is not compared to tobacco products that kill half of the users. It's against fresh air. And so if they are more dangerous than fresh air, there is a problem. If they're safer than tobacco, then for adults that's a different story. But in terms of high school students, it really is not a space you want to be going to if you can avoid it.
All right, Prof, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Quite alarming numbers there. Hopefully many of our young people who are watching will really know the impact of vaping on their young bodies. That was Professor Richard van Zyl-Smit, a researcher at the University of Cape Town's Lung Institute.